Did you know that medieval queens weren't just about pretty dresses and grand castles? From the 12th to the 15th centuries, these powerful women navigated treacherous political landscapes, facing down ambitious rivals, and even their own families who dared challenge a queen's authority. What epic battles for power. Number 1. Elizabeth Woodville and Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The year is 1483. England is still reeling from the decades-long Wars of the Roses, a brutal fight for the crown between the houses of York and Lancaster. Elizabeth Woodville, a queen who ascended to power through a secret, scandalous marriage, now faced her ultimate political opponent, her own brother-in-law, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Their clash would redefine the English monarchy. Elizabeth Woodville's story was already extraordinary. She was a Lancastrian supporter in a Yorkist court, a widow with children when she captured the heart of the handsome young King Edward IV of York. Their secret marriage in 1464 shocked the English nobility, who had expected Edward to marry a European princess for political gain. This union immediately created enemies for Elizabeth. Powerful noblemen like Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, who felt slighted and challenged by the Queen's influence. Warwick eventually turned against Edward, briefly deposing him. Yet Elizabeth weathered these storms, always fiercely protective of her growing family and their royal rights. Power reached its peak, with King Edward IV on the throne, and her sons, particularly Edward, Prince of Wales, lined up for succession. She used her position to elevate her family, marrying her siblings and children into prominent noble houses. This practice, while common for queens, further alienated old nobility, who saw the Woodvilles as upstarts, gaining too much influence. The Queen's family, particularly her brothers Anthony and Lionel, gained significant wealth and titles, creating a new power block that often clashed with established aristocratic families. When King Edward IV suddenly died in April 1483, the political world of England erupted. Elizabeth Woodville was plunged into a desperate struggle to protect her young son, the 12-year-old Edward V, who was now king. The obvious choice for protector of the realm was the late king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was a formidable figure, a skilled soldier and administrator, known for his loyalty to his brother and his stern sense of justice. Many in the court, weary of the Queen's Woodville relatives and their perceived ambition, looked to Richard to stabilize the kingdom. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation. Elizabeth, knowing the dangers of a powerful male regent, tried to secure her son's immediate coronation. She wanted him to be crowned king before Richard could consolidate too much power. Her family gathered troops, fearing Richard's intentions. Richard, however, acted swiftly. He intercepted young Edward V while the boy was traveling to London from Ludlow. Richard arrested the boy's maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, and other key Woodville associates, accusing them of treason. He then brought Edward V to London, not for immediate coronation, but for safekeeping in the Tower of London, a traditional royal residence that also functioned as a prison. Elizabeth Woodville, realizing the gravity of the situation, immediately sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey with her younger son, Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters. This desperate act highlighted her fear and vulnerability. She knew the historical precedent. Once, a young king was in a regent's hands. His fate was precarious. From the sanctuary, Elizabeth continued to try and influence events, using her network of supporters within London and her connections to the church. She resisted all attempts to persuade her to leave sanctuary or to surrender her younger son. Richard of Gloucester, meanwhile, began consolidating his power. He executed Anthony Woodville and others without trial, effectively decapitating the Queen's family faction. He then spread rumors, questioning the legitimacy of Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, claiming it was bigamous, and therefore their children were illegitimate. This shocking claim made publicly was a direct assault on Elizabeth's status and the very foundation of her children's claim to the throne. The details of a supposed pre-contract between Edward IV and Lady Eleanor Butler were brought forward by a bishop, further fueling the doubts. On June 25, 1483, an Assembly of Lords and Commons declared Edward IV's marriage invalid, clearing the path for Richard to claim the throne. Just 2 days later, Richard was proclaimed King Richard III. The two young princes, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, remained in the Tower of London. They were last seen in the summer of 1483. Their disappearance became one of history's most enduring mysteries, widely attributed to Richard III, though never proven. Elizabeth Woodville, stripped of her royal status and with her sons gone, remained in sanctuary for months. Her political world had crumbled. Her power was completely diminished. However, she was not entirely defeated. Secretly, she began to plot with former Lancastrian enemies, particularly Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor, who had a distant claim to the throne. They agreed that Henry Tudor should invade England, defeat Richard III, and marry Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses and ending the cycle of civil strife. This alliance, forged in secret and desperation, was Elizabeth Woodville's final, desperate political gamble. When Henry Tudor successfully invaded in 1485, defeating and killing Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Elizabeth Woodville's daughter became Queen of England. Elizabeth herself, though no longer Queen, Mother, lived to see her grandson, the future King Henry VIII, born. Her struggle against Richard III was a devastating personal loss, but her ultimate political maneuvering ensured the survival of her bloodline on the English throne. Number 2. Anne Boleyn and Thomas Cromwell. In the glittering, high-stakes court of King Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn, a woman of sharp intellect and even sharper ambition, became the focus of one of history's most dramatic power. Her primary political opponent, ironically, was a man who had once been her ally, Thomas Cromwell, King Henry VIII's chief minister and architect of the English Reformation. Their clash was not merely personal. It was a battle for influence over the king, the direction of religious reform. Anne Boleyn's rise was meteoric. For years, Henry VIII had been desperate for a male heir, and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had failed to produce one. Anne, a lady-in-waiting, captivated the king. She was monarchic, fashionable, and well-educated, with a strong personality that matched Henry's own. Her refusal to become his mistress, insisting on marriage, pushed Henry to seek an annulment from Catherine. This quest, known as the King's Great Matter, plunged England into a political and religious crisis, severing its ties with the Pope and establishing the Church of England. During this tumultuous period, Thomas Cromwell emerged as Henry VIII's most trusted advisor. A man of humble origins, Cromwell was a brilliant lawyer, administrator, and political strategist. He engineered the legal and parliamentary framework that allowed Henry to break from Rome, dissolve the monasteries, and assert supreme authority over the Church in England. Anne Boleyn and Cromwell initially worked together. Anne was a proponent of religious reform, holding evangelical leanings and supporting the distribution of English Bibles. Cromwell, a shrewd pragmatist, saw the king's desire for Anne as an opportunity to implement his own vision for a reformed church and a stronger, more centralized monarchy. Their alliance, however, was born of convenience and ambition, not true solidarity. Once Anne was crowned queen in 1533 and gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The dynamic shifted. Henry still craved a son. Anne, despite her intelligence, struggled to provide the male heir. The king desperately desired 2 subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriage. Her outspoken nature, her frequent political interventions, and her strong opinions began to grate on Henry. She often clashed with Cromwell over the distribution of monastic wealth, royal finances, and foreign policy, particularly concerning alliances with continental Protestant powers. Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, recognized the king's growing disenchantment with Anne. He saw Anne's failure to produce a male heir as a weakness, and her increasingly assertive political role as a threat to his own influence and the stability of the kingdom. While Anne championed religious reform, she also had powerful enemies at court, particularly among the old nobility, who resented her influence and the changes she brought about. Cromwell, ever attuned to the shifting winds of royal favor, began to distance himself from the Queen. Political struggle intensified in the early months of 1536. Henry VIII had become infatuated with Jane Seymour, a demure lady-in-waiting who offered a stark contrast to Anne's fiery personality. Cromwell, understanding Henry's desire for a new queen and a legitimate male heir, saw an opportunity to secure his own position and remove a powerful, unpredictable rival. He began to gather evidence and construct a case against Anne. The charges brought against Anne Boleyn were devastating and seemingly fabricated. Adultery, incest with her brother George Boleyn, treason, and even conspiring to kill the king. Cromwell's network of informants and his mastery of legal manipulation were fully deployed. Key courtiers, musicians, and even Anne's own brother were arrested and interrogated, likely under torture or threat. The sheer speed and secrecy of the accusations shocked the court. Anne Boleyn, isolated and without her former allies, found herself trapped. She was arrested on May 2, 1536, and imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same place she had been taken with such triumph before her coronation. She fiercely denied all charges, asserting her innocence. However, the legal system under Henry VIII and Cromwell was designed to serve the king's will. The trials were swift and biased. Queen and her alleged co-conspirators were found guilty. Thomas Cromwell, by orchestrating Anne's downfall, consolidated his power immensely. He had removed a significant obstacle to his political agenda and demonstrated his indispensable loyalty to the king. He meticulously managed the legal process, ensuring that the outcome served Henry's desire for a new marriage and a fresh attempt at securing a male heir. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed by a French swordsman on Tower Hill. Her execution sent shockwaves across Europe. It was an unprecedented act. A reigning Queen of England executed for treason. Her death paved the way for Henry VIII's marriage to Jane Seymour, just 11 days later, who would finally give him his longed-for son, Edward VI. The political struggle between Anne Boleyn and Thomas Cromwell illustrates the brutal realities of power in the Tudor court. It was a contest of wills, ambition, and shifting loyalties, where a misstep, a loss of royal favor, or a failure to adapt could lead to catastrophic consequences. Cromwell's tactical brilliance and ruthlessness ultimately triumphed over Anne's spirited but ultimately vulnerable position as a queen who failed to deliver the one thing her king desired most: a son. Number 3. Eleanor of Provence and Simon de Montfort. Eleanor of Provence, Queen of England, as the wife of King Henry III, found herself locked in a fierce political battle with one of England's most powerful and rebellious barons, Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. Their clash was not merely a personal feud, it was a fundamental struggle over the very nature of royal power and governance in 13th century England, a conflict that ultimately plunged the kingdom into civil war. Eleanor arrived in England in 1236, a young woman from Provence, known for her beauty and her cultural refinement. She married King Henry III, a monarch who, despite his artistic sensibilities and devotion to religion, was often perceived as weak, indecisive, and too easily influenced by foreign advisors. Eleanor quickly established herself as a formidable figure in court. She brought her own foreign relatives, the Savoyards, to England, and her uncles, like Peter of Savoy, gained significant lands and influence. This favoritism towards foreign relatives, particularly the Queen's family, angered many English barons who felt their own rights and positions were being eroded. Eleanor was not a passive queen. She was politically active, intelligent, and fiercely loyal to her husband and her children. She managed royal finances, played a role in diplomacy, and often advised the king. She was known to be a shrewd businesswoman and a strong advocate for her family's interests. However, her efforts to promote her Provençal kinsmen and her perceived extravagance contributed to the growing discontent among the English nobility. Simon de Montfort, an ambitious and medaf nobleman, was initially a favorite of Henry III. He was, in fact, Eleanor's brother-in-law, having secretly married her sister Eleanor, the widowed Countess of Pembroke. However, their relationship soured over a debt and other disputes. Montfort grew increasingly critical of Henry III's wasteful spending, his reliance on foreign favorites, and his refusal to consult with his barons on important matters of state and finance. Montfort emerged as the leader of a powerful baronial reform movement. The conflict escalated in the 1250s and 1260s. The English barons, frustrated by royal misgovernance and Henry's failed foreign policies, particularly his attempts to secure the Sicilian crown for his second son, Edmund, demanded reforms. They wanted a greater say in government limits, on royal power, and an end to the perceived influence of foreign courtiers. In 1258, a group of barons led by Montfort forced Henry III to accept the Provisions of Oxford, a radical document that effectively placed royal government under the control of a baronial council. Eleanor of Provence was a fierce opponent of these reforms and of Montfort's growing influence. She saw the provisions as an attack on her husband's royal prerogative and her own family's position. She actively worked to undermine Montfort and his supporters. She often tried to persuade Henry to resist the baronial demands, urging him to reassert his authority. Her diplomatic efforts were significant. She traveled to France to raise support and funds for her husband, pledging her own lands and jewels as collateral. She was a key figure in trying to restore her husband's absolutist rule. Her direct antagonism towards Montfort and the baronial party was evident in her actions. When London citizens, who largely supported Montfort, demonstrated against the Queen as she was sailing down the Thames, they pelted her barge with stones and mud. This incident highlighted the deep unpopularity she faced among certain segments of the population, partly due to her staunch opposition to the reforms. Eleanor, however, did not waver. Political struggles spiraled into open warfare, known as the Second Barons' War. In 1264, at the Battle of Lewes, Simon de Montfort achieved a decisive victory, capturing King Henry III and his son, Prince Edward. Montfort became the de facto ruler of England, imposing a radical new form of government that saw increased parliamentary representation. With her husband and son held captive, Eleanor of Provence became even more determined. From abroad, she tirelessly worked to gather an army. She assembled mercenaries in France and Flanders. Leveraging her Provençal connections and diplomatic skills, she secured loans and military aid, intending to invade England and rescue her family and restore royal authority. Her efforts demonstrated remarkable resilience and political acumen in the face of defeat. She was, in many ways, the royal family's strongest advocate during their captivity. However, Montfort's rule in England proved to be short-lived. Prince Edward, Henry III's son, managed to escape captivity. He raised an army and, with the support of disillusioned barons who had grown wary of Montfort's increasingly autocratic rule, confronted Montfort at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. Simon de Montfort was decisively defeated and killed in battle. Eleanor of Provence eventually returned to England, her husband and son restored to power. While she had faced immense personal hardship and political setbacks during the war, her unwavering loyalty to her husband and her relentless efforts from abroad had played a crucial role in the event. Her long and bitter political struggle with Simon de Montfort was a testament to her strength and her deep commitment to the Plantagenet dynasty, marking a period of intense constitutional upheaval in English history. Number 4. Mary, Queen of Scots, and John Knox. Mary, Queen of Scots, a young Catholic monarch raised in the sophisticated French court, returned to a Scotland profoundly transformed by the Protestant Reformation. Here she found her fiercest political opponent, not in a rival queen or a foreign invader, but in John Knox, a fiery Protestant preacher whose uncompromising religious zeal and powerful oratory directly challenged her authority, her faith, and her very right to rule Mary's early life. Crowned Queen of Scotland as an infant, she was sent to France to be educated and later married to the French Dauphin, Francis. She grew up accustomed to the absolute power of the French monarchy and the Catholic faith. When Francis died in 1560, Mary, a young widow, returned to her native Scotland in 1561. Scotland, however, was no longer the Catholic kingdom she had left. A powerful Protestant movement, driven by the likes of John Knox, had swept through the country. The Scottish Reformation had dismantled the old church, destroyed monasteries, and established a Calvinist-inspired Protestant faith as the dominant force. Powerful Scottish lords, many of whom had embraced Protestantism, held significant political power. John Knox was the undisputed leader of this religious revolution. A stern, uncompromising Calvinist, he believed passionately in the absolute authority of God's word and saw Catholicism as idolatry and an abomination. He had spent time as a galley slave, then as a minister in Geneva under John Calvin, and had returned to Scotland with a fervent mission to purify the nation from what he considered the corrupting influence of the papacy. His sermons were powerful, often inflammatory, and deeply influential among the Scottish populace and many of the Protestant lords. Clash between Mary and Knox was inevitable and immediate. Mary, despite her deep Catholic convictions, initially adopted a policy of tolerance, allowing Protestants to practice their faith while she maintained her private Catholic Mass. This compromise, however, was unacceptable to Knox. He believed a Catholic monarch had no legitimate right to rule the Protestant nation. His sermons frequently attacked Mary, directly denouncing her Mass as idolatry and her French customs as immoral. He famously published The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, a tract that, though written before Mary's return, underscored his belief that female rule was unnatural and against God's law. Their confrontations were legendary. Mary summoned Knox to her presence, multiple times engaging him in heated debates. In these private audiences, Mary, a shrewd and intelligent debater, tried to reason with him to understand his extreme views and to assert her authority as queen. Knox, however, was unyielding, challenged her directly, accusing her of persecuting God's true religion and warning her of divine judgment. He spoke of the horror of her Mass and told her that the princes of the world were often led by blind affection to commit folly. Knox's sermons in Edinburgh were political events. He would preach against royal entertainments, dances, and Catholic practices, often inciting his listeners to defy the Queen's authority. He viewed Mary's proposed marriages, particularly to Catholic princes, as a direct threat to the Protestant future of Scotland. When Mary married her cousin Lord Darnley, a Catholic, in 1565, Knox saw it as a severe setback for the Reformation. He continued his public denunciations, rallying public opinion against the Queen's religious policies and personal choices. The political struggle was a battle for the soul of Scotland. Mary attempted to govern and navigate the turbulent waters of Scottish politics, trying to balance the demands of her Catholic faith with the reality of a Protestant nation. She sought to consolidate her power, assert royal prerogative, and secure her lineage. Knox, on the other hand, worked tirelessly to ensure Scotland remained a Protestant nation, advocating for the supremacy of God's law as interpreted by the Reformers over the Queen's will. He was a master of public persuasion, using his pulpit to sway popular opinion and pressure the Protestant nobility. Conflict between them contributed to the instability of Mary's reign. The constant religious agitation, fueled by Knox's sermons, undermined her authority and created a climate of suspicion and rebellion among the Protestant lords. When Darnley was murdered in 1567, and Mary subsequently married the Earl of Bothwell, a Protestant lord widely suspected of the murder, the political landscape became even more volatile. Protestant lords, many influenced by Knox's uncompromising stance, openly rebelled. Mary was eventually forced to abdicate her throne in 1567 in favor of her infant son James VI. She fled to England in 1568, seeking refuge with her cousin Queen Elizabeth I, only to be imprisoned for the next 19 years. John Knox continued to preach and influence Scottish politics until his death in 1572. He had in many ways won the political battle against Mary. His vision of a strictly Protestant Scotland had largely prevailed. The clash between Mary, Queen of Scots, and John Knox was a fundamental struggle between a divinely appointed monarch and a divinely inspired preacher, a contest over faith, power, and the future identity of a nation. It highlights how deeply intertwined religion and politics were in the medieval and early modern periods, and how a matic figure with powerful beliefs could challenge even the most absolute of rulers. Number 5. Catherine de' Medici and Francis, Duke of Guise. Catherine de' Medici, Queen Mother of France, found herself trapped in a brutal political and religious conflict against the powerful and ambitious Francis, Duke of Guise. This was not a personal vendetta alone. It was a desperate struggle for control of France during the tumultuous Wars of Religion, a period of relentless civil strife where the future of the French monarchy and the Catholic faith hung in the balance. Catherine arrived in France from Florence in 1533 to marry Henry II, son of King Francis I. For years she remained in the shadows, overshadowed by her husband's mistress and struggling to produce heirs. However, her fortunes changed dramatically when Henry unexpectedly became King Henry II and later died in a jousting accident in 1559. Her eldest son, Francis II, inherited the throne but was a sickly teenager. Catherine, now Queen Mother, stepped into the political arena, determined to protect her son's authority and maintain the Valois dynasty. The House of Guise was a powerful aristocratic family, fiercely Catholic and deeply ambitious. Francis, Duke of Guise, was a celebrated military leader, famous for recapturing Calais from the English. His younger brother, Charles, Cardinal of Lorraine, was a prominent churchman. Their niece, Mary, Queen of Scots, was married to Francis II, giving the Guise family immense influence over the young king. They saw themselves as the true defenders of the Catholic faith and the natural leaders of France, effectively sidelining Catherine and her own influence. Political struggle between Catherine and the Guises was intensified by the rise of Protestantism, known as Huguenotism in France. While Catherine initially sought a policy of religious tolerance to maintain peace and stability, the Guise family adopted an uncompromising hardline stance. They believed in crushing Protestantism by force. This fundamental disagreement on religious policy formed the core of their fierce political opposition. With Francis II on the throne, the Guises controlled the government, appointing their allies to key positions and effectively marginalizing Catherine. They used their influence to pursue a harsh anti-Huguenot policy, leading to widespread arrests and executions. Catherine, though technically Queen Mother, felt her authority and her son's future were threatened by their dominance. She was a master of intrigue, patient and subtle, and she began to lay plans to regain control. The opportunity arose with the sudden death of Francis II in December 1560. Catherine's second son, Charles IX, was only 10 years old. As Queen Mother and Regent, Catherine seized the reins of power. She immediately began to pursue a policy of religious reconciliation, hoping to unite the fractured kingdom. This included issuing the Edict of Saint-Germain in 1562, which granted limited tolerance to Protestants, allowing them to worship publicly outside walled towns. This policy was anathema to the Guises. Francis, Duke of Guise, along with his brother Charles, led the Catholic faction in open defiance. The climax of their opposition came with the massacre of Vassy in March 1562. Francis, Duke of Guise, and his armed retinue encountered a group of Huguenots worshipping in a barn near Vassy. Confrontation ensued, resulting in the massacre of dozens of unarmed Protestants. This brutal event sparked the First War of Religion, plunging France into a prolonged period of civil war. The massacre at Vassy was a direct challenge to Catherine's policy of tolerance and her authority as regent. Francis of Guise positioned himself as the military leader of the Catholic League, essentially a rival power center to the crown. He commanded Catholic forces, winning victories and further consolidating his popular support among staunch Catholics. His actions constantly undermined Catherine's attempts to mediate and achieve a lasting peace. The Duke's popularity and military prowess made him incredibly dangerous to Catherine's vision. For a stable monarchy, he was a direct threat to her children's future and to the crown's ability to maintain central control. Catherine, a shrewd political operator, continually sought to balance the power of the Guises against the Protestant leaders, often using one faction against the other to prevent any single group from becoming too dominant. She was always trying to maintain royal authority, even if it meant making temporary alliances with those she distrusted. The struggle continued until Francis, Duke of Guise, was assassinated in February 1563 during the siege of Orleans. His death, likely at the hands of a Huguenot assassin, removed Catherine's most formidable and uncompromising political opponent. The Guise family, though still powerful, lost their most medic and militarily effective leader. Catherine de' Medici, now truly in control of her young son King Charles IX, continued to navigate the treacherous waters of the wars of religion. Her political struggle with Francis, Duke of Guise, showcased her resilience, her political cunning, and her unwavering determination to preserve the Valois monarchy amidst a nation tearing itself apart. She outmaneuvered a man of immense military and political power, ultimately ensuring her family's immediate hold on the French throne, even if the religious conflicts continued to rage for decades. Number 6. Blanche of Castile and Peter Mauclair. Blanche of Castile, Queen and later Regent of France, faced one of her toughest political opponents in Peter Mauclair, Duke of Brittany. Their conflict represented a broader struggle between a powerful, centralized monarchy and a collection of ambitious, semi-independent French barons who resented royal authority and sought to assert their own feudal rights. Blanche's political acumen and iron will were tested to their limits by this rebellious nobleman. Blanche arrived in France in 1200 as part of a peace treaty between England and France, marrying Louis, the son of King Philip II. Augustus. She quickly adapted to French court life, demonstrating an acute political mind and strong character. When her husband became King Louis VIII in 1223, she became queen. Upon his death in 1226, Blanche was thrust into the role of regent for her young son, the future king, Louis IX, who was only 12 years old. This immediately made her a target for ambitious nobles who saw an opportunity to exploit the weakness of a minor king and a foreign-born queen. Peter Mauclair, whose surname, Mauclair meaning bad cleric or ill-educated, highlighted his reputation for challenging authority, was a powerful and turbulent figure. He was the Duke of Brittany, a wealthy and strategically important region in northwestern France. Peter had married Alix, the heiress to Brittany, and asserted his independence from the French crown. He was known for his restless ambition and his willingness to defy royal commands, often playing French and English interests against each other to his advantage. He was also related to the royal family, which gave him a degree of legitimacy among his rebellious peers. Blanche's regency was immediately challenged by a widespread baronial revolt. Many powerful French lords, including Peter Mauclair, Hugh X of Lusignan, and Theobald IV of Champagne, formed a coalition to undermine her authority and the young king's position. They resented Blanche's firm hand, her foreign origins, and her determination to centralize royal power. They believed they could dominate a minor king and a woman regent. Their primary goal was to weaken the crown and reclaim traditional feudal liberties and lands they felt had been encroached upon by previous strong kings. Peter Mauclair emerged as one of the most persistent and dangerous leaders of this baronial opposition. He allied with other rebellious lords, and at times even sought the support of the English king Henry III, who was Blanche's cousin. He initiated open rebellion, refusing to pay homage or taxes to the crown, and engaging in military actions against royal forces. His strategic location in Brittany, with its access to the sea and potential for English alliances, made him a constant threat. Blanche of Castile responded with remarkable strength and strategic brilliance. She refused to be intimidated by the rebellious barons. Instead, she took decisive military action. She personally led royal armies, a highly unusual feat for a queen, particularly a regent. She marched against the rebels, laying siege to their castles and forcing them to submit. Her firm stance and military leadership surprised many who underestimated her because of her gender. Against Peter Mauclerc, Blanche employed a combination of military force and shrewd diplomacy. She isolated him from his allies through negotiations and promises, or by decisively defeating his confederate. She understood the power of propaganda and public opinion, often portraying the rebellious barons as disloyal and dangerous to the stability of France. She cultivated alliances with loyal nobles and relied on the growing support of the church, which largely backed the young king. One notable incident highlighting their conflict occurred when Blanche and Louis IX were traveling. Peter Mauclerc and his allies ambushed the royal party near Montelher. Blanche and her son were forced to take refuge in the castle, surrounded by hostile forces. Blanche sent urgent pleas for help to the citizens of Paris. In a remarkable display of loyalty, the people of Paris rallied, marching to the aid of their queen and young king, driving off the attackers. This event demonstrated Blanche's ability to rally popular support and her courage in the face of direct military threat. Blanche steadily broke the power of the rebellious coalition. She defeated Hugh X of Lusignan and secured a peace treaty with him. She systematically eroded Mauclerc's alliances and his financial resources. By 1234, Peter Mauclerc was largely isolated. He was finally forced to submit to Louis IX, acknowledging royal authority and swearing fealty. Though he later resumed some rebellious activities, he never again posed the same level of threat to the crown. Blanche of Castile's regency was a resounding success. She not only suppressed the baronial revolts, but also secured the succession of her son, ensuring his education and training for kingship. Her firm and decisive actions against formidable opponents like Peter Mauclerc preserved and strengthened the French monarchy at a crucial period. She demonstrated that a queen regent, even a foreign one, could exercise power more effectively than many male monarchs, earning her a lasting reputation as one of France's most capable rulers. Her struggle against Peter Mauclerc was a pivotal chapter in the consolidation of royal power in medieval France. Number 7. Margaret of Anjou and Richard, Duke of York. Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England, as the wife of the gentle King Henry VI, faced her fiercest political opponent in Richard, Duke of York. This was not a mere disagreement. It was a desperate, bloody struggle for the very crown of England, erupting into the brutal Wars of the Roses. Margaret, a fierce and intelligent woman, fought relentlessly to secure her son's inheritance against a powerful claimant who challenged the legitimacy of her husband's rule. Margaret arrived in England in 1445, a beautiful and spirited young woman from the French house of Anjou. She was married to King Henry VI, a devout and pious man, but one who often lacked the political will and mental stability required to rule a turbulent kingdom. Margaret quickly realized that she would need to be the driving force behind the throne. She immersed herself in English politics, becoming fiercely protective of her husband's interests, and more importantly, the future of their expected son, Richard, Duke of York, was a powerful figure in England. He was a wealthy landowner, a respected military commander, and crucially, a descendant of both King Edward III's second and fourth sons. This gave him a strong dynastic claim to the throne, stronger in some eyes than the reigning House of Lancaster, which descended from Edward III's third son. York was a man of integrity and ambition who grew increasingly frustrated with Henry VI's weak rule, the corruption at court, and England's disastrous losses in France. Political struggle began subtly with York demanding reforms and a greater role in government. However, as King Henry VI's mental health deteriorated, suffering periods of complete incapacity, the vacuum of power became immense. Margaret of Anjou, driven by a deep love for her husband and an even deeper determination to protect her infant son, Edward, Prince of Wales, stepped into the void. She refused to allow York to become protector of the realm during Henry's incapacitation, fearing he would usurp her son's rights. The birth of Prince Edward in 1453 intensified the conflict. York had previously been the heir presumptive. Now, with a direct male heir, his path to the throne was blocked. Margaret became even more dedicated to securing her son's undisputed succession. She viewed York as a dangerous rival who threatened her family's very existence. York, in turn, felt marginalized and believed the government under Margaret's influence was mismanaging the kingdom. Conflict escalated into open warfare in 1455, beginning what became known as the Wars of the Roses. The Battle of St. Albans marked the first major clash where Yorkist forces defeated the Lancastrians, capturing King Henry VI. Margaret, however, refused to surrender. She raised armies, rallied loyal noblemen, and personally directed military campaigns, proving herself to be a formidable commander and strategist. She was often described as being more kingly than her husband. Their political struggle was a relentless cycle of battles, truces, and broken promises. York, initially claiming only to reform the government and remove corrupt advisors, eventually made his claim to the throne explicit in 1460, marching on London and entering Parliament with his hand on the empty throne. The Act of Accord was grudgingly passed, recognizing York as Henry VI's heir, disinheriting Margaret's son, Prince Edward. This was an unacceptable outcome for Margaret. She refused to let her son be disinherited. She raised an army in the north of England, gathering support from loyal Lancastrian lords. Her personal leadership and fiery speeches rallied troops to her banner. In December 1460, her forces decisively defeated Richard, Duke of York, at the Battle of Wakefield. Richard was killed in the battle, and his head was displayed on the walls of York, adorned with a paper crown. Margaret's victory was short-lived. York's son, Edward, Earl of March, a formidable military leader, continued the fight. He decisively defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton in 1461, one of the bloodiest battles on English soil. Edward was crowned king. Edward IV, and Margaret, Henry VI, and Prince Edward were forced to flee into exile. Even in exile, Margaret refused to give up. She spent years in France, raising funds, seeking alliances, and desperately trying to find support for her cause. She became known as the She-Wolf of France by her enemies, a testament to her tenacity and ferocity in defending her son's claim. She briefly returned to England and restored Henry VI to the throne with the help of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, who had switched sides. This was a temporary triumph. However, the final act of their struggle, even after York's death, came in 1471. Edward IV returned to England, defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Margaret's son, Prince Edward, was killed in the battle, and Henry VI was murdered shortly after Margaret herself was captured. Political struggle between Margaret of Anjou and Richard, Duke of York, consumed England for decades. It was a clash of two determined figures, each convinced of the righteousness of their cause. Margaret's unwavering fight to secure her son's inheritance, even after devastating losses, solidified her image as one of medieval history's most formidable queens. Driven by maternal devotion and a fierce commitment to the Lancastrian dynasty. Number 8. Empress Matilda and Stephen of Blois. Empress Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England, engaged in a brutal and protracted political struggle for the English throne against her cousin Stephen of Blois. This conflict, known as the Anarchy, plunged England into nearly 2 decades of civil war, a chaotic period where royal authority collapsed and the country suffered immense devastation. Matilda, a woman of formidable intellect and iron will, fought relentlessly to claim her birthright. Matilda's early life was one of immense prestige and power. She was the granddaughter of William the Conqueror and the daughter of Henry I. At a young age, she was married to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, becoming Empress. After his death, she returned to England and her father, Henry I, who, having lost his only legitimate son, declared Matilda his heir to the English throne and the Duchy of Normandy. He made his powerful barons swear an oath to uphold her succession. However, medieval England was a deeply patriarchal society. Many barons found the idea of a female ruler unpalatable, especially one who had been absent from England for so long and who was now married to Geoffrey of Anjou, a traditional enemy of the Norman nobility. When Henry I died in 1135, his nephew, Stephen of Blois, acted swiftly. Stephen was a popular and monarchic nobleman, well connected within the English aristocracy. He quickly seized the throne, arguing that the oath sworn to Matilda was invalid and that a woman was unfit to rule. He secured the support of the church and many key barons and was crowned King Stephen. Matilda was incensed. She viewed Stephen as a usurper who had stolen her rightful inheritance. Her political struggle against Stephen became the defining feature of her life. She was a shrewd political operator and a military leader in her own right, but she faced immense challenges as a woman attempting to assert authority in a male-dominated world. Conflict erupted into widespread civil war known as the Anarchy. From 1138 onwards, Matilda established her base in Anjou and Normandy, leveraging her husband Geoffrey's resources, and began to launch invasions into England. Her half-brother, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, a powerful and respected nobleman, became her chief military commander and most loyal supporter in England. The struggle was a brutal war of attrition, characterized by shifting allegiances, besieged castles, and widespread devastation. Both sides claimed legitimacy, and both inflicted terrible suffering on the land and its people. Matilda's strengths lay in her determination and the unwavering loyalty of her key supporters. Stephen, though initially popular, struggled to maintain control due to constant revolts, his own financial difficulties, and the strategic gains made by Matilda's forces. A key turning point came in 1141 at the Battle of Lincoln. Matilda's forces, led by Robert of Gloucester, decisively defeated Stephen's army, capturing the king himself. This was a monumental victory. Matilda was proclaimed Lady of the English and entered London preparing for her coronation. Her supporters believed the war was effectively over. However, Matilda's political weaknesses became apparent. She was often described as haughty and uncompromising, lacking the conciliatory skills needed to win over wavering nobles or the populace of London. She refused to grant Londoners their traditional liberties and taxes, alienating key support. Stephen's wife, Queen Matilda, and his brother Henry of Blois, the Bishop of Winchester, rallied their forces. In a counterattack, Robert of Gloucester was captured, leading to an exchange of prisoners, Stephen for Robert. The war resumed. Matilda continued to fight from her stronghold in Winchester, but she never truly regained the momentum. She eventually retreated to Normandy in 1148, leaving her young son, Henry Plantagenet, to continue the fight in England. Though she never sat on the English throne as a crowned queen, she had kept her claim alive and fiercely contested Stephen's rule for years. Her political struggle with Stephen was a testament to her unyielding spirit. She had a network of loyal supporters, particularly her half-brother, who fought tirelessly for her cause. She raised armies, managed political negotiations, and endured immense hardship, including being besieged in Oxford Castle and escaping dressed in white to cross snow-covered fields. Conflict finally concluded in 1153 with the Treaty of Winchester. By this time, both Matilda and Stephen had lost their eldest sons, and Stephen's claim was weakened by internal dissent and the growing strength of Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet. The treaty stipulated that Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but Henry would be his adopted son and successor. Stephen died the following year, and Henry Plantagenet ascended to the throne as King Henry II, establishing the powerful Plantagenet dynasty. Empress Matilda's political struggle against Stephen of Blois was a defining moment in English history, despite never achieving her ultimate goal of being crowned queen. Her relentless pursuit of her birthright and her powerful resistance to usurpation ensured that the legitimate line of succession to her son was eventually restored. She demonstrated that a queen, even when denied the crown, could be a formidable and enduring political force. Number 9. Isabella of France and Hugh Despenser the Younger. Isabella of France, Queen of England and wife of King Edward II, found her fiercest political opponent, not in a foreign power, but in a man who had become her husband's most trusted advisor and lover, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Their conflict was a bitter struggle for influence over the king, control of the English government, and ultimately a fight for survival that would dramatically reshape the English monarchy. Isabella arrived in England in 1308, marrying King Edward II, a man already struggling with the weight of kingship and his controversial relationships with male favorites. Isabella, known for her beauty and intelligence, quickly proved to be a capable and politically astute queen. She gave birth to 4 children, including the future King Edward III, solidifying her dynastic importance. She tried to work with Edward to support his rule and to secure her children's inheritance. However, Edward II's reign was plagued by unpopular favorites who drained the royal treasury and alienated the powerful English nobility. His first major favorite, Piers Gaveston, was eventually exiled and then murdered by a vengeful baron. The vacuum of power was soon filled by Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father. Hugh Despenser the Elder, Hugh Despenser the Younger, was ambitious, ruthless, and utterly obsessed with accumulating wealth and power. He quickly captivated King Edward II, becoming his closest confidant and advisor. The Despensers used their influence to amass vast lands, wealth, and titles, dispossessing other noble families through legal manipulation and outright force. They dominated the royal court, effectively controlling access to the king and making all major political decisions. This rise of the Despensers directly challenged Isabella's position and power. As queen, she expected influence and respect. Instead, she found herself increasingly sidelined and humiliated. The Despensers actively worked to isolate Edward II from his queen, even controlling her personal finances and household. Stories circulated that Despenser refused her entrance to her own property and even stole her jewels. This personal degradation fueled Isabella's simmering resentment. Political struggle between Isabella and Hugh Despenser the Younger became a battle for control of the king himself. Isabella, desperate to regain her influence and protect her son's future, tried repeatedly to reason with Edward, but he remained utterly devoted to Despenser. The Despensers' arrogant and greedy behavior also alienated the wider English nobility, who formed an opposition group known as the Ordinances. In 1321, a coalition of barons, including the powerful Roger Mortimer, revolted against the Despensers, forcing their temporary expenser. However, Edward II quickly recalled his favorites and retaliated against the rebellious barons, executing many, including Mortimer's uncle. Roger Mortimer himself was imprisoned in the Tower of London, but he eventually escaped and fled to France. Isabella was now in an impossible position. Her marriage was broken, her influence was non-existent, and her life felt increasingly threatened by the Despensers, who controlled every aspect of the court. In 1325, a critical diplomatic opportunity arose. Edward II sent Isabella to France to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, King Charles IV of France, over the Duchy of Aquitaine. This mission was Isabella's chance to escape the Despensers' tyranny. Once in France, she publicly refused to return to England as long as the Despensers held power. She formed a powerful alliance with Roger Mortimer, who had joined her in France. Together, they became the leaders of an invading force aimed at overthrowing Edward II and the Despensers. This was an unprecedented act. A queen invading her own kingdom with a foreign ally. Their invasion force landed in England in September 1326. The Despensers' unpopularity was so profound that few rallied to Edward II's defense. Many of the English nobility and even parts of the royal army defected to Isabella, and Mortimer, the Despensers, and Edward II were forced to flee. The political struggle culminated in the capture and gruesome public executions of Hugh Despenser the Elder and, more famously, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Despenser the Younger was tried for treason, theft, and corruption, condemned and subjected to a horrific death in Hereford in November 1326, which included being hanged, drawn. His death was a stark symbol of the populace's hatred for him and the decisive victory of Isabella and Mortimer. With Despenser gone, Isabella and Mortimer effectively controlled the kingdom. Edward II was captured, and in January 1327, he was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, the 14-year-old Edward III. Edward II was imprisoned and likely murdered later that year. Isabella of France, by orchestrating the downfall of Hugh Despenser the Younger, emerged as the most powerful figure in England, effectively ruling as a regent, alongside Roger Mortimer. For her young son, her fierce political struggle against Despenser showcases her cunning, resilience, and ultimate ruthlessness. When pushed to the brink, she proved that a queen, when sufficiently enraged and politically astute, could overthrow even the most entrenched and hated of royal favorites, completely changing the course of English history. Number 10. Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and fascinating women of the Middle Ages, found herself in a fierce political struggle, not just with a rival monarch or a rebellious baron, but with her own husband, King Henry II of England. Their conflict was a clash of two immense wills, a battle for dominion over their vast Anglo-French empire, and a struggle for the loyalty and future of their sons. Eleanor's life was already extraordinary before her marriage to Henry II. She was the Duchess of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most culturally sophisticated regions of France. She was also Queen of France, having been married to King Louis VII. Their marriage was annulled, partly due to the lack of a male heir and their differing personalities. Just weeks later, in 1152, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy, a matic and ambitious young man who was also Duke of Anjou. And Count of Maine, 2 years later, he became King Henry II of England. Their union created an immense cross-channel empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Initially, it was a formidable partnership. Eleanor was a dynamic queen, bringing cultural refinement and political acumen to Henry's court. She gave birth to 8 children, including 5 sons, ensuring the Plantagenet dynasty's future. However, the very vastness of their empire and Henry's ambition for centralized power became the source of their fiercest conflict. Henry II was a strong autocratic ruler, determined to impose his authority over his vast territories and his powerful vassals, including his own sons. Eleanor, on the other hand, was fiercely independent and accustomed to ruling her own lands. She saw her Duchy of Aquitaine not merely as a possession of the English crown, but as a distinct entity to be governed by her or her preferred sons. Political struggle intensified over the future of their sons. Henry wanted his sons to be subservient to him, acting as his lieutenants in their designated territories. Eleanor, however, desired more autonomy for her sons, particularly for Richard, whom she favored for Aquitaine. She encouraged them to assert their rights and rule their own territories, a stance that directly contradicted Henry's centralized vision. The tension culminated in the Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174. Eleanor's eldest living sons, Henry the young king, Richard and Geoffrey, rebelled against their father, Henry II. They sought to gain more power and independence, frustrated by their father's reluctance to grant them full control over their designated inheritances. Crucially, Eleanor actively encouraged and supported their rebellion. She traveled through her territories in Aquitaine, rallying support for her rebellious sons against their father. She even provided them with political counsel and perhaps financial aid. This direct support for her sons' rebellion against their own father made Eleanor a key political opponent to Henry II. She directly challenged his authority, his control over his family, and his very ability to rule his empire. Henry, viewing her actions as high treason and an intolerable threat, acted decisively. Eleanor was captured in 1174 while attempting to flee to France. Publicized as a man, Henry II had her imprisoned. She was held in various English castles, including Winchester and Salisbury, for the next 15 years. Her imprisonment was a political move to neutralize her immense influence and prevent her from further stirring up rebellion among her sons or the Aquitanian nobility. Even in confinement, Eleanor remained a powerful, albeit distant political force. Her imprisonment fueled resentment among her loyal Aquitanian subjects and her sons, particularly Richard, who continued to scheme against his father. While she was unable to directly participate in politics, her very existence and the injustice of her long imprisonment influenced the political landscape. Henry II, despite his power, could not erase her from the political equation. Eleanor was finally released from imprisonment in 1189 upon Henry II's death. She was nearly 70 years old, but her political power was far from diminished. She immediately re-entered the political arena with full force, becoming a central figure in the succession of her favorite son, Richard I, the Lionheart. She skillfully secured his accession to the throne, managed the kingdom during his absence on crusade, and even traveled to Germany to negotiate his release from captivity. Eleanor's long political struggle with Henry II was a defining period for both of them. It was a contest of wills that showed how, even within a royal marriage, deep political disagreements could lead to outright war and long-term imprisonment. Eleanor of Aquitaine, despite years of forced inactivity, proved to be an indomitable political force, outliving her powerful husband and ensuring the continuation of her family's legacy on the English throne. Through her sons, her ability to bounce back and wield immense power in her later years solidifies her reputation as one of the most formidable medieval queens.